Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today with my friend and colleague, Leon Brenner. We will be talking about this terrific book, The Autistic Subject on the Threshold of Language. I'll say a few words about Leon, and then we'll ask him to help us introduce the book. But just to say right from the outset, it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to someone who's doing really path-breaking work in Lacanian theory, who is using a series of ideas to really illuminate an area of psychical functioning, an area of subjectivity, a mode of being, which is increasingly important to understand and work with and engage in today's world. So, as you can see, this is the book. You should try and get hold of it. It's an excellent account, both for those who are new to Lacan and those who are interested in how Lacanian concepts may be refined and developed to do the work of thinking and engaging autism. So Leon is a research fellow at the University of Potsdam. He's in the Institute of Philosophy in that university, and his fields of interest are obviously psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, as well as philosophy of mind and contemporary French philosophy and autism research. So I'll do the rounds of applause myself. And Leon, let's ask you, one way of asking you to talk a little bit about and introduce your book is to say, why did you feel it was important to write a book on Lacanian, distinctively Lacanian perspectives on phenomena relating to autism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Derek, really happy to be here today. So I'm looking forward to our chat. Yes, the thing that got me to start working on this topic was a certain, let's say, disappointment from the depth of the theory that I've encountered in terms of autism outside the field of psychoanalysis. And studying psychology as well in my academic past, I couldn't find any theory that really got me interested and engaged with, let's say, the properly autistic phenomenon, like I said, the ways that autism manifests uniquely in the different patients that come to the clinic. I was saying, okay, if I can't find anything that satisfies me on Google Scholar, I'll go to Lacan, which that was a field of my engagement in the past, and I've been engaging with Lacan for years before. And then I found that Lacan said maybe 2 sentences on autism in a lecture in the United States, actually. And well, he said that it might seem that autistic people do not listen, but surely there is something to say to them. In a way, he was implying that being autistic doesn't mean that you are divorced of language, of the field of language, but there is something that is frozen about the way that you use language that is unique. And then doing some more investigation in contemporary Lacanian psychoanalysis, I found some extremely interesting theories. And I have to say that, generally speaking, my approach, the approach that I take as a researcher in the field of Lacanian psychoanalysis, is one that comes to identify the fragments that we can find in Lacan and his followers, and to produce something of it that is not necessarily strictly speaking to those that are endowed with this terminology or discourse. So my project on autism as a whole is an attempt to take what is fascinating about the way that French psychoanalysts and specifically Lacanian psychoanalysts look or view the mind and the autistic psyche, and try and provide a perspective on it that can be engaging for people from without the field of Lacanian psychoanalysis as well. And hopefully my book generally attempts to do that. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Leon. I mean, one of the compliments that I've already tried to pay to your book is the way that you use a series of Lacanian concepts, but you don't just use them in the way they've routinely been used, but you add to them, you refine them, you really enable them to do some kind of critical, analytic work with describing and getting us to be able to grapple with the phenomena of autism. Let me follow that, though, with a question which many Lacanians and presumably even people with only a minimal understanding of Lacan will bring to you and presumably have brought to you. In Lacanian theory, we're always presented with the three key diagnostic structures of perversion, psychosis, and neurosis. And the question typically is, well, where does autism fit in here? Is autism, as often seems to be the default assumption, simply somehow within the mode of psychotic structure? Or is it supposed to have its own distinctive place? And I know there's some varying debates about that, but how would you respond to that question? Where do we locate autism within the given structural categories that Lacanian psychoanalysis gives us?
Yes. Well, I'll start with the answer because I think it's better to do that way than you're sort of losing a layer of obscurity. What I argue in the book is that autism is a singular subjective structure that cannot be reduced to any of these general diagnostic categories. So in this sense, I argue that autism should entail a completely new clinic, even, you can say. So this is what I think, but this is an extremely relevant question, and a lot of people don't know that outside of the field of psychoanalysis, because autism at its inception was considered to be a form of psychosis. So in the history of psychoanalysis, when today we see some cases treated by psychoanalysts like Melanie Klein, like Donald Meltzer, like Bruno Bettelheim, etc. A lot of these patients are considered and even termed psychotic. Now, it's not so surprising because a lot of the symptoms, or many at least, that we see in the clinic of psychosis manifest in one way or another in the clinic of autism at face value. So obviously, disturbances in language, in the use of language, bodily disturbances, repetitive movements, the use of neologisms. There's a lot of things that go on that have a certain resemblance. But then if we go even back to Freud and his papers on neurosis and psychosis, Freud's rudimentary attempt to distinguish the two. And we know that Freud engaged with psychosis, but not fully. But even at that point, when he wrote these papers, he said, well, look, it's problematic to distinguish neurosis and psychosis on the level of the apparent manifesting symptoms or the way that the subject reacts to whatever is the underlying cause of this psychic manifestation. He said, on this level, things are too similar. We can get confused. He said, we should go back to the cause in structural terms. And he said, we should look at the mechanism, the psychic mechanism that underlies these symptoms, that is their cause, that causes the mental structure to operate in this specific way. And for Freud, it was the distinction between repression in neurosis and what he called a more, more fundamental or a stronger form of repression. That's how he called that at the time in psychosis, later naming it in translation to English, disavowal and also rejection. So this is how Freud distinguished neurosis and psychosis on the basis of this kind of mechanism. So the question that a lot of psychoanalysts ask themselves today, and the fact that my book states one thing doesn't mean that that it's the consensus. A lot of psychoanalysts ask themselves, well, should I treat my autistic patients in the same way, or at least through these same general clinical guidelines that I use with my patients that are autistic. And what I try and demonstrate in the book is that if we really go into the workings of this fundamental psychic mechanism that puts the psyche in place and sort of gets it in place and says, okay, let's go, let's see the world. And if we pay attention to this mechanism, we see that there are very crucial differences between the mechanism that we see in autism and the mechanism that we see in psychosis. So what I do in the book is sort of, I approach the problem from a different direction. Instead of going and looking at autistic symptoms and psychotic symptoms and sort of convincing the reader that they're different, yeah, I go and investigate the psychic mechanisms that enable these symptoms to manifest in the first place. And by doing work which is conceptual and also based on case studies, I provide a case that argues that these two mechanisms cannot be confused, can definitely not be confused. And in this sense, one is completely singular as well as the other. So if this is the case, if the mechanism that, let's say, fixates the autistic psyche in place is radically different than the one that fixates the psychotic, perverse, and neurotic psyche in place, then we should seriously look at autism as a distinct mental structure and then try and theorize a different clinic, a different approach, a different understanding. And this is what I hope this book will compel readers and researchers to do.
Thanks, Leon. I mean, one of the most helpful elements of the book, also for people who are new to Lacan, is that you lay out in your second part of the book very systematically and very clearly the differences between neurosis and repression, as repression being the underlying mechanism of neurosis, and of course foreclosure and psychosis. Mm-hmm. Extremely helpful. It's a very useful platform, because by the time we get to the third part of the book, you start to speak more specifically about autistic foreclosure. So yes. Just having heard your comments, could you now tell us a little bit about what specifies, what really distinguishes what you refer to as autistic foreclosure?
Right. So yes, you've noted the fact that in the second part, I really go deeply into trying to provide the tools with which the further chapters on autism can be understood. I think this might be, sometimes it is my weak spot, my Achilles heel, that I always take the long route. And sometimes when you publish papers, you need to take the shorter but scenic route, right? So, but in the book, I hope it's a long scenic route that we take there. What I do in the book is I distinguish what I call autistic foreclosure. This is how I called it in this book. Foreclosure is the name that Lacan gives this mechanism that underlies psychosis. He replaces the term Verwerfung in German with Foreclusion. And this is how Lacan defines it in Seminar 3 and his other papers on psychosis. And when I was investigating this mechanism that underlies the autistic structure, I sort of agreed with many analysts that said that we're talking about a foreclosure there as well, as in terms of a total erasure and eradication. Yeah. What I do in the book is I distinguish autistic foreclosure on two levels. The first level is internal to the way that Freud describes the workings of a mental structure in general. So this is what I call the framework of primal repression. But maybe I can get into that in 1 second. the other aspect is not where exactly can we situate the functioning of autistic foreclosure in the structuration of the psyche according to Freud, but the second aspect is what psychic object is exactly foreclosed in autistic foreclosure. And by providing sufficient evidence that demonstrates that autistic foreclosure functions on a different level than psychotic foreclosure, and by suggesting several possibilities that can tell us something about the object foreclosed in autistic foreclosure, and showing that this object is distinct from the object foreclosed in psychotic foreclosure, I provide sort of a case for autistic foreclosure being a singular psychic mechanism.